Hello, health champions. Today we're going to talk about the top 10 most dangerous foods that you never want to eat. And we're going to do this in reverse order from least bad to most bad. And number 10 is refined grains. And here we have things like white bread, white flour, white rice, etc. We also have pasta, which some people think of as more healthy, and you could argue it's slightly more healthy, but we're going to talk about where it really fits. So white bread has a glycemic index of 75, and that's a measurement of how quickly your blood sugar rises after you eat a certain food. And glucose, pure glucose, is the reference at 100. So white bread is considered high glycemic index because it raises your blood sugar very, very quickly. And white rice is right there with it. But when we look at pasta, now that is 55. And on the official tables of glycemic index, that's considered low. And I put a question mark on that because we're going to talk a little bit about it. What is it low compared to? And if we look at something like pure table sugar, that only has a glycemic index of 65. So there, pasta would seem to be lower because sugar is lower than white bread, for example. But we have to understand how everything compares. What is it in relationship to? So when we look at the standard scale of low, medium, and high glycemic index, traditionally, everything under 55 is considered low glycemic index. And everything between 55 and 70 is considered medium, and everything above 70 is considered high glycemic index. But here's the thing. There are only carbohydrate foods on that standard glycemic index scale. So when you look up a list of glycemic index foods, they only pretty much have carbohydrate and starchy foods on there because as a culture, the world has more and more moved to where that is the foundation. That's what we eat the most of. And we're told, in fact, to eat 250 to 300 grams of carbohydrate as if that should be the foundation of our food. But I would like to introduce another scale for glycemic index, which I call real. And the reason I call that is that everything below 20 is what I think low glycemic index should be. And if you don't just look at the starchy and the bread and the carbohydrate foods, but you look at whole foods, which I believe is what we should eat the most of, namely beef, fish, chicken. We should have nuts and seeds. We should have non-starchy vegetables and leafy greens in abundance. And every single one of those foods fall in the below 20 range. And then you have between 20 and 40, we could have a few tubers like rutabaga and celery root. And those are things that you could eat occasionally, but they're still not as bad as the starchy food that we're told should be the foundation. And then as an exception, now you could occasionally have some sweet potato or some potato or even some white rice or some beans or something like that. But that should be the exception. If we eat whole food, low starchy vegetables and leafy greens for the most part, then almost everything, like 90% of what we eat, is going to fall in the below 20. So when we look at these numbers, we should put it in perspective and realize that these are foods that have created the greatest metabolic epidemic we have ever seen. Number 9 is fruit juices. So let's talk about a few different things. That there is fresh fruit, which I think that you could have in moderation and seasonally. And if you happen to live on a tropical island and your ancestors have been there for a few hundred years, then you're probably also adapted to some mango and some pineapple on more months out of the year, as long as you don't eat sugar and processed foods in addition to these things. But when we talk about pasteurized fruit juice, which is something completely different, then that is something that you probably want to avoid. Most of the live things and the enzymes and the energy that you find in fresh fruit has not survived that pasteurization. Plus, if you're talking about fruit juice versus fresh fruit, you're basically just getting the sugar more concentrated, so it's easier to consume more sugar. If you're going to do juice occasionally, I would suggest doing it fresh squeezed. And this is also not something that you should do on a regular basis, especially if you're insulin resistant. But if you wanted to have juice that you squeeze yourself from a grapefruit or an orange, then do that very, very occasionally. But that would be more like on birthdays and holidays and things like that. Maybe once a month, but don't turn it into a daily thing. So why am I calling these foods dangerous? Some people who clicked on this video might think that they would see some gory stuff, or you take a bite of this mushroom and you die or something like that. But I want to talk about the things that actually kill people on planet Earth today, the top killer diseases, which is heart disease, COVID-19 in 2021. It is no longer one of the greatest killers, but I put that here for a reason. We're going to put that into context. Then we have cancer, we have stroke, we have COPD or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, we have respiratory infections, dementia, we have type 2 diabetes, and then kidney disease and liver disease. These are the diseases that kill more people than anything else on planet Earth. So when I talk about the most dangerous foods, I'm talking about the types of food and the types of lifestyle that predispose you to these diseases, where there is a causal connection between what you eat and these diseases. And I'm going to give you a little graphic just to help make a point that for heart disease, for example, I feel, based on what I know and I've seen and heard and read, that this red area, somewhere around 90% of heart disease, is probably caused by foods that cause inflammation and that cause insulin resistance and metabolic disease. And this is not based on some specific research or anything. I'm going to give you a little graphic for each one, and it's just approximately how I feel about it. So don't take it too specifically, but I'm just trying to make a point that the most dangerous foods are the ones that cause the vast majority of these diseases. So as we go down the list, COVID-19 basically did not kill anybody who was metabolically healthy. And on the few occasions that they said, well, look at this one, he was healthy and he died, well, they probably weren't as healthy as they thought. When we look at cancer, we look at stroke, we look at COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that is mostly caused by smoking, so that's a little bit less. Then we have respiratory infections. Again, that's an infection. The pathogen is the primary cause, but metabolic disease is an aggravating factor. And then we have dementia, type 2 diabetes, kidney disease, and liver disease. That the vast majority of the cases are caused by these metabolic problems. And the only other really, really significant factor would be smoking for lung disease and also for cancer. But other than that, the vast majority of these diseases are caused by our modern lifestyle and our tendency to eat sugar and ultra-processed foods. Number 8 is fried food. And here we have things like French fries and potato chips, but even other things that we fry, like shrimp or chicken or just about anything else, is going to be high starch. We're going to use potato flour or white flour or some kind of starch to soak up all that oil that we're frying it with. And the oils we use for frying, for the most part, are not going to be the healthy oils. They're going to be really bad and unhealthy, such as seed oils and soybean oil and sometimes corn oil. And here we start off with an excess of omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acids. We're going to shift our inflammatory responses in the body toward pro-inflammatory. But in addition to that, these oils are extremely harshly processed. We make them with high heat and high pressure and lots of chemicals. So Even if some of these seeds were okay as a food to start with, by the time we make oil from it, we have changed the product so much it is not healthy anymore. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, not only do we have bad oils to start with, but when we're frying things, we're going to be reusing the oil over and over and over. And every time that we reheat it or we keep it heated and put more food in, we're going to turn that oil more and more toxic. Number 7 is low-fat foods. And here, of course, I'm not talking about leafy greens and non-starchy vegetables. I'm not talking about foods that are normally low in fat and it's a whole food. I'm talking about foods that should have some fat in nature, but we remove it. And we have things like sweetened yogurt. We have low-fat or non-fat yogurt. We add some berries, and then we add a ton of sugar to make it taste good. And one of the biggest problems here is that this is a food that is marketed and perceived as healthy. The vast majority of people who buy these sweetened yogurts think that they're doing themselves a favor. So I'm not opposed to yogurt, but I would suggest that you make your own. And here's an interesting little fact that something's very popular in the US is called Greek yogurt. And the funny thing is this has nothing in common with the yogurt that they make in Greece. Because in Greece, they use full fat or even half and half. It's a very, very creamy yogurt, somewhere between 7 and 10% fat. Whereas in the US, they usually sell it as fat-free Greek yogurt. And all they've done is they've strained it to remove the water so it becomes very firm, but it's still very low fat. So what I would suggest when I make my own, I use whole plain milk and then I mix it about 50-50 with half and half. So the resulting mixture comes out around 7%. And that seems to be kind of the magic number where you get a really creamy and firm texture without having to strain it or do anything else to it. And then you can add a few berries, either fresh berries or thawed out frozen berries, and just a few drops of stevia to just sweeten it a little bit. Sometimes I don't even bother with the stevia because I like that tartness, but for those who want a little bit of sweet, you can put in a few drops of stevia. And once you've tried this a few times, you will never ever buy the store-bought stuff again. Another problem with the low-fat foods are things like dressings and condiments. So I'm talking about salad dressings and mayonnaise and so forth that normally have a lot of fat, and they get a lot of their flavor and their characteristics from the fact that they are mostly fat. So now they develop a low-fat or a non-fat version from something that's supposed to be fat, which means that they basically replace everything in the original food and you get all these fat substitutes. And you have to ask yourself, if they take away the fat from something that's supposed to be fat, what are they putting in instead? So here we're getting all these synthetic texturizers and all these semi-plastic compounds that have nothing to do with food. Number 6 is breakfast cereals. So now we're working our way toward the worst foods. And very often with cereals, they start off with a processed grain. Sometimes it could be wheat, or very often a lot of cereals are based on corn. And now, unless they're organic, it's going to be GMO corn. But then, of course, with cereals, they always add varying degrees of sugar, anywhere from just a tiny little bit to where 50% of the cereal is pure sugar. And then, of course, there are artificial colors and artificial flavors. But then in order to make it look healthy, they also sprinkle some synthetic vitamins on it so that you can have your GMO corn and your white flour and your sugar with a sprinkle of vitamins so that the list says that it has so many % of your recommended vitamins, etc. But don't fall for it. This is very little to do with food, and those nutrients are basically useless in that form. But here again, we run into this problem like that we did with orange juice, that these are perceived as healthy. There's a lot of people who start their day off and they think that they're doing a good thing for themselves by stuffing themselves or their kids full of this. The closest I get to a cereal is when I make my homemade yogurt, like I just described. And then I add what I call chillax to it. And that is, you grind up chia seeds and flax seeds and you mix them together and you get chillax. And on top of that, I might put some pecans or some pumpkin seed or something like that. So there's no grain, no sugar, nothing. It's very filling, tons of fiber, tons of minerals and nutrients. So now we're on the home stretch, and here we find the really dangerous foods. So candy and snack bars is number 5. They are based on sugar typically, and then they want some flavor and some texture, so they add some fats, but it's not going to be your butter and your extra virgin olive oil. It's going to be these processed seed oils, the soybean oil, etc. And then we have a couple of things that most people consider very healthy, such as granola bars and trail mix. And they say, well, I don't eat candy, I just have granola bars. Well, sometimes they can be okay. It depends on how many ingredients and if the first ingredient in there is something synthetic and some white flour, or if it's more of a nut or a seed in a whole food form. Same thing with trail mix. That's usually mostly nuts, but by the time they fill half of that thing up with raisins and a little bit more in there with M&Ms, now it's not so healthy anymore. They call it trail mix, but it's really just candy. And then there's this huge trend of protein bars, because some people catch on to the fact that candy bars are not so great for you. They know that Snickers and Mars are not real food, so they try to present it a little better in the form of protein bar. But the proteins in there are usually not the best to start with, but also either they add in the same amount of sugar in the protein bars that they did in the candy bars, or they put in substitutes. And what they usually use for a substitute are going to be sugar alcohols like sorbitol or erythritol. And those can be okay in moderation. Like if you had one here and there, that wouldn't be too bad. But if you start eating these on a regular basis, if you have these protein bars on a daily basis, either they're going to be full of sugar and you get too much of that, or if you have one with sugar alcohol, now that's going to be too much probably. That's going to have a great probability of upsetting your gut flora. You're going to be creating an imbalance in the bacteria in your microbiome because you selectively feed certain species with these sugar alcohols. And in this category, I also put Pop-Tarts that an astounding percentage of people use because it's so simple. You keep it in the freezer, you keep it in the shelf, you can just open it up, and some of them you can put in the toaster or whatever. And again, it's simplicity, but all you're getting is white flour and sugar and chemicals and seed oils, and there's nothing in there. One of my pet peeves is when they say made from or made with, and then they use a small percentage of something that's supposedly good for you, like strawberries or cherries. But again, don't be fooled. And here again, we run into the thing about perceived as healthy. A lot of people probably know that candy bars and chocolate and snack bars are not the greatest, but a lot of people would probably pick some of these others, the granolas and the trail mix, and think that they're doing something healthy for themselves. Number 4 on the list is ice cream. And just like the name says, it's supposed to have cream in it, and which is a high-fat product that could be, if it's raw cream, it wouldn't be a terrible thing. However, now we add a pile of sugar with this, and now we make it very, very addictive. So cream by itself and fat in itself is usually very satiating, that it almost limits itself. You can only eat so much butter. You can only have so much cream by itself. But then 50% of it almost would be sugar, and now that sugar has that drug-like effect. And the combination is extremely addictive, and the sugar overrides that satiating effect. So now because of the sugar, you're going to be tending to overeat. And of course, when you overeat ice cream, now you're getting a ton of sugar, but also fat along with it. And you're going to eat way more fat than you would in any other form without the sugar. And ice cream, I would say, would have to be my Achilles heel if there is one. So I couldn't care less about granola bars or low-fat yogurt or a lot of other things that we're going to talk about in this video. But if I get into a tub of really nice quality, good ice cream, I cannot help myself. I will have one serving after the other until the thing is gone. And of course, knowing what I know, then I just choose not to keep it around the house. Number 3 is baked goods. So here we have things like cookies and pastries, which contain sugar and white flour and bad fat. So it's like we're getting the worst from each of the previous categories, but then we add something else as well. And one form of a baked good, of course, is cakes. So now you get all of these bad things, and then we add shortening, which is hydrogenated fat. So we start with the worst of the worst, which is these harshly processed vegetable oils, but then we make them hard. We harden them with hydrogenation, and now we create trans fats, and we change these molecules even more into something that doesn't happen in nature. And then on this list, of course, is donuts as well. So we're getting all of the previous dangerous things, but now we add the frying on top of that. So we add one more step of something that makes it even more harmful. Number 2 is sugary drinks. And the reason I rank this as worse than anything previously on the list is that these are so easy to come by. It's so easy not to think about it. They're everywhere, and they're so much a part of our lives. So we have the soft drinks, there's vending machines, there's soda machines everywhere. Even things like lemonade. That sounds more natural. Give the kids some lemonade, but the sugar content is the same. Another thing people don't think about is sweet tea. They think, I'm just having some tea. But again, the sugar content, we're not talking about a teaspoon or 2. We're talking about 8 or 10 teaspoons for a large glass. And then we have all these coffee drinks that have been popularized by all the coffee chains. They started off selling coffee, but that wasn't addictive enough. So if they really wanted to get into the big money, they have to start selling people sugary drinks that are extremely addictive. And if you're in there getting a coffee, look at what people are ordering. It's like 1 out of 10 people are getting a black coffee or maybe a cappuccino. The rest of them are getting all of these sugary concoctions. Another version of a soda is energy drinks, which is basically the same thing as a soft drink, but now they've added extra caffeine or maybe some herbs or some other stimulants. And of course, energy drinks don't give you energy, they steal energy. They make you appear as if you have some energy in the moment, but you're borrowing. You're going to have to pay it back. And then there's something called nectar, which is basically just a worse form of fruit juice. They start off with a fruit juice, but then they add sugar and some citric acid and some flavorings to really jazz it up. So it's extremely tasty, but again, you're getting pure sugar water. Another sugary drink a lot of people don't consider is coconut water. So, okay, if you're again on a tropical island and you crack open a coconut and you drink down the juice, that's probably fine. But if it's been packaged, then you don't know quite what they've done with it. And a lot of the packaged ones are going to have added sugar as well. And here I also want to talk about the diet drinks with artificial sweeteners. So after people realize sugar is not good, and then someone sells them on an idea that you can have your drink, you can have your bubbly sweet drink, just no calories. You can use artificial sweeteners like sucralose and aspartame and saccharin, but that is not a great idea. You're getting away from the sugar. So on the surface, it looks like you're not getting the same metabolic problem, but in the long run, you're creating problems that are at least as bad. And the number one absolute most dangerous food or drink is alcoholic drinks. And here we have to look at 2 things. We have to look at the type of alcoholic beverage and how many of those drinks do you have in a week? And then we want to put the type of drinks kind of on a gradient here from the least bad to the worst. Now, it's going to be very different for people on how many drinks is too many. 0 would always be the best, but there are a lot of people who are not going to give it up. They enjoy a glass of red wine. They enjoy a little whiskey. And the general numbers that they talk about is for some people, like pregnant women or people who are sick or severely metabolically challenged, you should probably have 0. And for women, they typically say that you should have no more than 7 per week. And for men, they say no more than 14 per week. But again, this is not going to be in concrete. It's going to depend on your health status. And for a lot of people, as they get older, they should probably do well to lower that number a little bit also. So when we talk about the type of alcoholic beverage, from the least bad to the worst, we start off with distilled spirits. So these are things like vodka, gin, bourbon, whiskey, rum, cognac, etc. And the reason that they're not as bad is that they have no sugar. It is only the alcohol. So the 2 worst things for the liver is sugar with 50% fructose and alcohol. So fructose and alcohol can only be processed by the liver. And this is why it is so easy to overwhelm the liver with alcohol and fructose. And it used to be that the only people with fatty livers were alcoholics, but then as we started introducing more and more sugar in our diet, we quickly had non-alcoholic fatty liver become dominant. So fructose and alcohol are the 2 worst substances for the liver, and the liver is very much responsible for all of these diseases, or the liver's ability to resist these diseases depend on what we're eating and if we're metabolically healthy. So if we're having a drink with only the alcohol, then we're only getting 1 bad factor. But if we're drinking something with alcohol and sugar, now we're kind of attacking the liver. We're overwhelming it with 2 different factors at the same time. Then the next category would be dry wine. So dry white wine or dry red wine would have a couple of grams of sugar per glass. So distilled spirits, if they're pure, have 0 sugar in them because they're distilled. The dry wines have a little bit. And then next would be beer. Beer doesn't have any sugar, but it has other carbohydrates. It's a malted beverage. So it's made from grain and it still has some of that grain in it. So it's not as bad as sugar, but it's still a carbohydrate that's going to raise insulin a little bit. And then even a little bit worse would be sweet wine. When they have added a lot of sugar to it, now we're getting the alcohol and the sugar to a greater degree. And probably the worst of all would be the mixed drinks, the tropical drinks, the ones that you order in a bar. They're super tasty, but the last bottle that they add in when they mix the drink is usually pure sugar if they didn't start with a soft drink or a fruit juice or something else with a lot of sugar in it. Even so, they typically still add some sugar to make that thing super sweet. So now you're getting a lot of the alcohol and you're getting a lot of the sugars. It's like you're drinking twice as much in terms of the load on the liver. If you enjoyed this video, you're going to love that one. And if you truly want to master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure you subscribe, hit that bell, and turn on all the notifications so you never miss a life-saving video.